So we just finished talking about the carbon cycle and the role that soil plays in that cycle. But carbon is not the only element where soil plays a very important role in the biogeochemical cycling of that element. Nitrogen is another element that is essential for living organisms. And while carbon may be the scaffold for the big biological molecules, nitrogen is also extremely important because it is a major component of proteins and DNA molecules. And that being the case, the flow of nitrogen between living and non living sources is another very important cycle in environmental systems. And the good news is that nitrogen as an element is extremely abundant. Nitrogen gas makes up about 80% of the gas found in the Earth's atmosphere. It is by far the most significant component of our atmosphere. The bad news is that this gaseous form of nitrogen is completely useless to most living organisms. So, why is that the case? Well, as you can see in this figure showing the molecular structure of nitrogen gas, it is a covalent molecule. Remember that a covalent molecule is one where the atoms that make up that molecule are sharing electrons with each other, not transferring them, but sharing them in the same orbitals. And in the case of molecular nitrogen, each atom of nitrogen in this pairing brings not one, not two, but three atoms to the table. So these nitrogen atoms are very deeply invested in this covalent bond that they share with each other. And that makes the bond very strong. And the molecule itself is very stable. So it is very, very difficult to crack this molecule open and get at the atoms of nitrogen so that they could be incorporated into other biological molecules like DNA and proteins. Almost no living organisms can do this, but the ones that can are soil bacteria. Some aquatic bacteria can do this as well, but we're giving special attention to the soil dwelling varieties in this chapter because of the interplay they have with soil and agriculture. And collectively, these bacteria are called diazotrophs. And on the slide is one example of a species called Azospirillum. So Azospirillum and other diazotrophs can perform what's called nitrogen fixation, the process of capturing gaseous molecular nitrogen out of the atmosphere and transforming it into a different molecule called ammonia, NH3, nitrogen with three hydrogens attached to it. And you may remember that we defined carbon fixation during the carbon cycle as the process of photoautotrophs capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and incorporating it into biological molecules. Same principle with nitrogen fixation. And converting molecular nitrogen into ammonia is key because, unlike gaseous molecular nitrogen, ammonia is a form of nitrogen that organisms, namely plants, can incorporate into biological molecules. So these nitrogen fixing bacteria will transform nitrogen gas from the atmosphere into ammonia and make it available for plants to absorb. Then plants will absorb that ammonia from the soil and use it to build some of their most important biological molecules, DNA and proteins. This step, where the plants take up the ammonia, is called ammonium assimilation. And eventually, those plants are going to die. And the organisms that ate those plants are going to die. And so there's also a step that completes this cycle, which is where the decomposers in the soil take that organic material, the DNA, the proteins that are left over after an organism dies, and break them all the way back down into ammonia. And this step is called ammonification. So nice, neat, clean loop. But there's actually another layer of complexity here. Because this ammonia here is not only in demand by plants, the NH3, the ammonia, but also by certain types of soil bacteria called nitrifying bacteria. And nitrifying bacteria don't want the ammonia for its nitrogen, but rather for its electrons. Nitrifying bacteria can actually use ammonia as an energy source. They can oxidize it to extract electrons, much like heterotrophs do with carbohydrates like glucose when they perform cellular respiration. This is a process called nitrification, and the result is that the ammonia, NH3, is transformed into an ion called nitrate, NO3 with a negative electric charge. This form of nitrogen, the nitrate ion, is also agreeable for plant absorption. So in addition to getting some nitrogen from ammonia via ammonium assimilation, plants will take up the nitrate ion too, which is a waste product of that nitrifying bacteria process. And then they will use it as a source of nitrogen to build their important organic molecules. This process is called assimilatory nitrate reduction because in the process, nitrogen gets assimilated at the same time that it is being reduced, or in other words, electrons get added to the molecule and it gets built into something bigger, a bigger organic molecule like DNA or protein. And there's one final leg of this cycle that we need to talk about, and that has to do with the fact that, once again, the nitrate here, the NO3 minus, the nitrate is in demand not only by plants, but soil bacteria under certain circumstances. Do you remember back in chapter 2 when we talked about the alternative processes to cellular respiration? We had talked about the fact that cellular respiration requires oxygen to extract the energy from organic molecules like carbohydrates. And when oxygen is not available, there are these two other processes that heterotrophs turn to, which are called anaerobic respiration and fermentation, to break down carbohydrates in a different way that doesn't require oxygen. So in the first one, anaerobic respiration, oxygen is subbed out for another molecule which will perform the exact same function as oxygen in this process. And a common oxygen substitute is nitrate. So, getting back to the nitrogen cycle, it's not just plants that want this nitrate as a source of nitrogen for their biological molecules, but under oxygen depleted conditions, bacteria want it as well because it allows them to run anaerobic respiration and continue to extract energy from carbohydrates. This process, whereby bacteria use the nitrate as an oxygen substitute, is called denitrification, and it leads to the transformation of the nitrate back into molecular nitrogen, nitrogen gas, which then gets released into the atmosphere. And while this does complete the cycle, it poses a challenge for agriculture, this denitrification step. Because what farmers really want to happen to that nitrate is not that it gets consumed by the denitrifying bacteria and turned back into this useless nitrogen gas form. What they want is for as much nitrate as possible to be channeled into assimilatory nitrate reduction, where it gets taken up by the crop plants. And as such, keeping soils well aerated is a great way to prevent denitrification from happening because bacteria will only need the nitrate if oxygen is not available as a backup. So waterlogged soils have a big problem with denitrification, taking away the efficiency of plants being able to assimilate nitrate, because the lack of air circulation within a waterlogged soil means that microbes will start to use the nitrate instead of oxygen, and that limits the availability of the nitrate to plants. Okay, so that was a lot of information. And so a summary and a recap is warranted to try to tie this all together. So nitrogen is an extremely important element for living things. And although molecular nitrogen, gaseous nitrogen N2, which you see at the bottom of this figure, very bottom, although it is extremely prevalent in the atmosphere, it is useless to almost all living organisms in this form because it's too stable to break open. Only certain types of bacteria can perform nitrogen fixation, which turns that nitrogen into a more useful form of ammonia. Plants can then take up that ammonia from the soil through a process called ammonium assimilation and use it in their biomolecules. When organisms die, decomposers will reverse that process and break the biomolecules back down to release their nitrogen in the form of ammonia. But it's not just plants that use ammonia. Other types of soil bacteria can perform nitrification as an energy generating process for their cells, which turns the ammonia into nitrate. And then plants can take up that nitrate in a process called assimilatory nitrate reduction and use it to create their biomolecules as well. However, plants have to compete with soil bacteria for the nitrate under oxygen depleted conditions because the nitrate can also be used as a substitute for oxygen in anaerobic respiration. And this leads to denitrification and the conversion of nitrate back into nitrogen gas. Whew, okay, so now we understand how nitrogen naturally cycles through the biosphere and the way that soil bacteria serve as a gateway for nitrogen to become accessible to other organisms. And after hearing in the last section about how prevalent of a role soil bacteria play in the carbon cycle, you might come away with the impression that there's plenty of nitrogen to go around from the soil bacteria. However, just the opposite is true. In many ecosystems, nitrogen is the primary limiting nutrient, meaning that plants have enough of everything else to extend their growth, but a lack of nitrogen is holding them back. And because of this, application of nitrogen fertilizers has become an extremely prevalent farming practice. And you can see here in this graph how the amount of nitrogen fertilizer applied per hectare of cropland has increased substantially in many major agricultural regions across the globe in the past 60 years. Industrial nitrogen production accounts for half of all nitrogen fixed in the biosphere now. Humans are performing roughly as much artificial nitrogen fixation as all of the bacteria in the world combined and using that for fertilizer. And if these increases in nitrogen fertilizer were leading to higher agricultural productivity, that would be one thing. And at one time, they did lead to substantial increases in agricultural productivity. And we'll talk about that in our next chapter. But now the fertilizer is being used more and more inefficiently. More than half of it leaches into underground aquifers and then washes off into streams and rivers and ends up in the ocean. In India, that figure is 70%. 70% of the nitrogen fertilizer washes off. And in China, that figure is 75%. And when this nitrogen runs off into bodies of water, it can fuel massive explosions in plankton population, where the plankton grow so quickly and extensively that they actually consume all of the oxygen dissolved in the water and suffocate other aquatic life, creating what's called a hypoxic area, also known as a dead zone in the ocean. And in this photo on the left, you can see one such plankton bloom in the Baltic Sea back in 2005. And on the right is a map where you can see a red dot placed on many of the ocean's coastal dead zones. The other problem with nitrogen fertilizers is their energy intensiveness. So in the early 1900s, there was a chemical manufacturing process now known as the Haber-Bosch process that was developed to synthetically transform gaseous molecular nitrogen into ammonia. Do the same thing that soil bacteria do biologically with enzymes. Humans use this technology to do it. The problem with this process is that it is extremely energy intensive. Molecular nitrogen is so stable that to break it apart requires this machinery to operate at 572 to 932 degrees Fahrenheit and at a pressure that is 25 to 35 times greater than our normal atmospheric pressure. So keeping these high temperatures and pressures requires truly an absurd amount of energy. The Haber-Bosch process consumes a full 1% of the world's total energy production and is responsible for 1.4% of carbon dioxide emissions, which may not sound like a lot, but when you're talking about all of the energy in the world, 1% of it going to this single industrial manufacturing process, that is truly an unbelievable amount of energy that is being used. And fossil fuels are being burned to drive this process. So the excessive global use of nitrogen fertilizers is contributing to environmental crises, both in terms of the waterborne pollution that it generates from nitrogen runoff and the energy investment it requires to make that nitrogen fertilizer in the first place.